Good morning. I don't know if that's still valid, but in Bavaria it's Mahlzeit starting at 11, but it's not yet 11, so thanks for showing up in such great numbers. I have to admit that I was curious as to whether that's a topic that's still relevant for a big majority at the conference, or if everybody says, well, that's boring. And if you read the description in the program, which I did this morning, just to make sure that I'm actually going to deliver what I've promised, it's completely screwed up and doesn't make any sense. And I'm sure that I may have handed in something that was screwed up, but not in that way. So some editorial process screwed that up. So actually you should not be here unless you have not read the program description, which probably means that you're either here to be entertained by my jokes, which never work, or you're in fact not running PHP 7. Because if you are, you will probably not enjoy that presentation a lot. This is definitely, as the title promises, if you're not yet running on PHP 7, then I'm going to talk a little bit about some experiences that we made and give you some tips and tricks on where to put the focus. So to be very honest with you, it's a weird topic. We worked with a large company starting last year, a big migration project where they did some really nifty things in PHP, like including long-running processes and daemons written in PHP and signal handling and everything. And we actually helped them to complete that pretty successfully. Of course, I have to say that here. But it was in fact successful. And at the time I thought, well, this is cool. I have some new insights and I want to create a presentation to share them. Then when the time comes to prepare that thing, the big problem is you always have to dig down into the old, deep, dark ages of PHP, kind of, and deal with things. And then all those memories come up and it's always emotionally very challenging to me. So I'll probably get pretty emotionally here and there, and then again, I'm known to be an emotional guy anyway, so don't worry. I'm one of 3 co-founders of the PHP consulting company, and I'm gonna spare you the bragging and just give you the commercial. We turned 10 this year, and we are disclosing a treat on every 10th of a month, and this is what we did to this date, and we're going to continue doing similar things until December. So you just might want to follow us on Twitter to get notified when the next cool thing turns up, and maybe there is something in it for you. That's all the advertisement you're going to get for today, and the rest you can find on Google. Let's talk about migrating to PHP 7, and let's start with selling that. I know that frequently people say, we would love to do all that and do a lot of things, but we don't get to do it because our boss doesn't think it's valuable or our client isn't willing to pay any money. So how do we sell that, internally or externally? And yes, of course, that is challenging, because it's always kind of, you're not really getting a lot as in new features. I mean, the language has cool new features, but just because the code runs on the new language doesn't mean that it makes use of any of that. So there is no real perceived benefit. Now, the cool thing about PHP 7 is it's really fast. So that's actually a selling point. You can say, we kind of get like 100% speed up. We just have to put in some engineering effort to get there. And there's probably going to be more speed up coming along the line with future versions of PHP. That may or may not help. If it's more about the numbers, well, you could try GDPR and say, we are running on outdated, unsupported versions. There is that page on php.net which shows the version support, and there is no PHP 5 version that's supported anymore. I think, Sebastian, you know better, which PHP versions, which 7 versions are still officially supported?
7.2 and 7.3.
Yeah, so we are quite far. And there is a stable release cycle, and this is going to continue. So basically, every year there's going to be a new minor version, and then an older version is going to go out of support. In former times, that was different. We're going to go in greater depth into that later. So you can actually go ahead and say, you know, we are running on unsupported software. So if there is a data breach, then somebody's going to come and look at our systems, and they're going to say, well, you were running outdated software that was unsupported, so you could not apply any security fixes because there were none, and now you got hacked. So yeah, well, probably somebody's going to sue you, and here's the bad news, your insurance is not going to pay you because you didn't upgrade. And that's a serious legal risk. So I may not like the fact that the world is that way, but you could actually try to make that a selling point. And it has worked pretty well last year. I can assure you of that. Another thing, incremental maintenance cost. I mean, we all know that it gets more expensive to maintain stuff over time. That's a no-brainer. But why do we never make that explicit? It's like, it gets more and more tedious to maintain things, so it gets more and more expensive. It takes longer to deliver things. The risk gets higher. We have more regressions. And suddenly then the client complains. Be internally or externally, whoever is using the system is going to complain and say, you know, you have become quite expensive in delivering new features. Because every new feature now is like a gazillion bucks, and it used to be a couple of hundred or 1,000 maybe. So why not make that explicit up front the next time you draft an SLA or a contract? And you say, okay, so dear customer, you have two choices. We can deploy that software and then keep maintaining it, just doing the bare minimum. Maintenance cost is going to go up every year because it's going to be more effort for us every year. So we are going to tell you now that each coming year, maintenance cost, by definition, will go up. And you can cut it down by, at any given point in time, saying, okay, I want to migrate to, up-to-date technology. That cuts the maintenance cost again. Or we can draw up a contract where we say, we're going to do that continuously and keep up to date, and then we can keep the cost at a steady level. And of course, the cost then factors in the migration work that you need to do. That may not help you a lot for existing contracts or situations, but the argument that maintenance gets more and more expensive is valid, because a lot of major PHP projects are PHP 7 only these days. So if you want to get something cool and decent on PHP 5, you either have to write it your own, or you have to backport a PHP 7 version. And I can assure you both of them are not fun. And then probably the question is going to raise, well, should we rewrite? Maybe Node.js or Golang or Erlang or something cool rather than that crappy old PHP? And you kind of will have to counter that if it's about moving to another language, because of course you want to stick with PHP. I'm just assuming that. I would. So you're saying, well, we could rewrite, but do we actually know what the system does? I mean, if we create a new system, what's it supposed to do? We don't even know what the existing software does. I mean, of course we know for the general business cases, but what about all those edge cases? Which edge cases does our system support in the first place? We don't know. And probably we have no big suite of automated tests, so we really have no means in, finding out or proving the point. So if we were to rewrite the software, which of the features could we drop? Which of the features were we supposed to recreate in the way they are, even though we don't know what they exactly are? And which of the features should we question and recreate in a different way? And suddenly there's going to be a lot of discussion that's basically usually ends up with, well, maybe we should not rewrite. Okay, so hopefully some of these ideas give you pointers as to trying to sell an upgrade. I know it's hard, I know it's tough, but trust me, the GDPR thing usually is a pretty good bet. So, assuming you have it sold, preparations, we need some getting ready for that migration thingy, whatever that exactly may be. So, first of all, we'll need PHP 7. And you're going to look at that, and if I were sitting in the crowd, like 5 years ago, looking at that slide, I would say, you know, that's the type of slide that you put up there if you really have no clue how to fill the time, because that's an absolute no-brainer. Yeah, that would have been 5 years ago. In the last 5 or even 10 years, I've seen many, many projects and many, many companies, and I can assure you, for some companies, it's really hard to get PHP 7 running on a system. For a lot of developers, it is hard to get PHP 7 or any other version of PHP running locally on their box. I'm old, and I still don't understand how, as a developer, you could potentially do work without having the language that you program in as software on your computer. But I'm seeing it every month somewhere. So there are a lot of companies out there who have a hard time getting code executed on some box, be that a live server or some staging server, dev box, or a local machine. And my recommendation to everybody would be, well, the first thing that you really need to do is install PHP 7, latest version, preferably locally. Maybe have some fun and play with it. Try to run your code base, see what happens. It's very educational. So, assuming that most of you probably are able to do that and probably maybe even have done it, that's in fact a no-brainer, but I know out there are so many instances where, actually the weirdest one I encountered was where we did a code review and I asked, so can you show me that class there? There was a class referenced. And I said, can we have a look at that class? And the dev said, no. I said, what? Yeah, no, I don't have the source code on my box. So don't ask me how they did it, but they actually managed to develop without running PHP locally and even without having source code locally. That's kind of weird. I mean, there are many things that you can't do that way, and we really don't want to go any deeper. But yes, I've seen bad things. So you're going to need a bunch of tools. And my first recommendation with regards to tools is, since you now have a current version of PHP installed, you should always run those tools on this current version of PHP. It doesn't absolutely make no sense to try to run existing current tools on PHP 5. It's not going to work out. So you need a current version of PHP on some box. If you have a setup where your dev box does not allow you to install PHP 7 easily, then set up a different box, install PHP 7 latest, and then go and have fun with some tools. The simplest tool, in fact, is the linter, which is built into PHP. You can invoke it by calling php-l at the command line. And essentially, that's going to run a syntax check on your file. Technically, it's compiling the file. And if there are any errors, it's going to tell you. And in fact, a lot of the easy, low-hanging fruit migration problems are due to, you have a function or class name that's a reserved name. Now, you can't use that. You can't use object as a name in PHP 7, I think, and you could before. So you have a class named object, and that's not possible in PHP 7. So it's technically a fatal error on compilation, and the linter is going to show you that. So the first thing you do is you run the linter. Whether you run the linter at the command line or you rely on your IDE to do that, it's up to you. The important thing is that you need files that are syntactically correct on that current version of PHP. Otherwise, all the analysis tools are just going to fail. But they will not tell you that they fail. They will just produce crap output that gives you a false sense of understanding. So, a good IDE has code inspections. Turn all of them on and start listening to them. They usually give you a pointer to, that's a problem there. Or that doesn't work in PHP 7. Sometimes they tell you outright, that doesn't work. Or there is warnings and stuff. So you get a feeling for how bad it is. Of course, it's not enjoyable to go through the whole code base and try to do that. So I'm not suggesting to do this. But what I'm suggesting is start to make that a habit to trust your IDE. So if you know which IDE to use, and just because I'm on camera, I'm not going to say the name, because otherwise SNS is going to get sued because it's a paid commercial or what? It's not paid, whatever. Don't.
I did it yesterday on camera, so.
You said the name?
Yeah, of course.
You said the name.
I'm going to do it again later today.
Okay. So I use PHP Storm, and I really like it, and they are not paying me to say that. So it's a free will decision, and I think it's a really good IDE. And there is even add-on with additional inspections, some of them as a paid version, and they are also really, really good. And they will just discover problems or point you at potential problems much earlier before you even get to write tests or before you even get to execute the code. So that does pay off. It's really worth to invest some money in that. And then there is that tool, the PHP 7 Compatibility Checker. It's available on GitHub. And the first thing it's going to tell you is this project is not supported anymore. Yes, that's because it's a tool that's assessing, you have PHP 5 code, and what are the problems when you try to run that on PHP 7. And PHP 7 is it's there, so there is nothing changing. If it's running on PHP 7, we're good. If it doesn't really care whether it runs on subsequent versions of PHP 7 too much. So even though the project is not maintained anymore, I like to use that tool because it gives you a list of things to look at. Again, it cannot possibly discover all the small and weird intricacies. So don't, if the list is short, don't be mistaken in believing that, everything's going to be smooth ride. There's a lot of things that the tool cannot detect, but some of the things it can, and they are usually pretty easy to fix. Sometimes it's just making the distinction between, is it a false positive or not? So in PHP 7, there is some changes in behavior with regards to, for each loops, if you work in combination with references and do weird things to the internal array pointer, PHP 7 behaves differently than previous versions, so whenever you do something like that, the tool is going to warn you and say, there might be an instance where you have a problem. And if you look at the code, most of the time you realize now there is no problem. Sometimes you just have to sort of rewrite the code a little or maybe add a guard clause to try to not do some stupid things. And there's other tools, and PHP Stan, for example, or I always forget the other one. And that website actually suggests that you should look into those tools. They are good tools, and they produce, again, just like the inspections in your IDE, valuable output, but less valuable for the PHP 7 migration. It's more about strictness in typing and stuff, and there's usually a lot to complain about in legacy code, but that really has nothing to do with the migration itself. So it's probably not, it does probably not make too much sense to look into those tools for the purpose of getting ready to migrate. Still, on the long run, with PHP 7, static code analysis will be more and more important. Okay, so one thing, and again, you may think, well, that's a no-brainer. Unfortunately, it's not. Basically, pretty much every large legacy code base that I get to see has some non-unique class names. They don't use auto-loading. They use a lot of conditional requiring and stuff. And technically, non-unique class names are used to either use this implementation or that implementation. For example, I've seen that for, if we're talking to a MySQL database, we're going to use that implementation of our database class. If we're talking to Postgres, it's going to be that one, but the name is the same. So the problem with non-unique names is you really can't do auto-loading in a decent fashion. Plus, all the tools are going to stumble because they sort of assume that names are unique because they tell you, hey, you have a problem in that class. But wait, in which implementation of that class? They are not really up to telling you that. So all the results that you get may be very confusing, but nobody will ever explicitly put there like, oh, you know, basically I'm going to give you crappy results because you have non-unique class names. So it's an assumption that is so fundamentally built into the tools that they don't even care to check it, it seems. So please do that first. It's actually very simple to do, right? So you have, in the example, you have two instances of a database class. Well, then rename one to MySQL database and the other one to PostgreSQL database, and then you just have to adjust your conditional loading, and that's all you need to do. So make sure you have unique class names. Now this is where the fun starts. Who regularly checks their error logs? Okay. It's like a major election. You always get kind of 50-50. And I don't want to come up with any conspiracy theories. But seriously, why -1? Because -1 is a bit field, and it turns every bit to 1, and internally error reporting is a bit field. And especially in the 5 series, new error classes have been added. And if you at some point went into PHP INI and put a value there, turns out that if you upgrade PHP to a later version, there is new errors that are not showing up. And you want to see all errors ever. So set it to -1. That's binary all ones, and you are going to see all errors. Of course, that might lead to a flooded error log. Well, that's exactly the point. That's exactly what you want to see. Now, you need to get into some kind of log file analysis, right? So getting all those errors, assuming that you have more than one production server, you want to aggregate those log files. There are different products that can help you do that. I do not like some of them for the pure fact that they are hosted products and you're basically uploading your logs to somewhere, and somewhere is not necessarily inside the European Union, don't get me wrong, but from a GDPR perspective, that's challenging. So I will not give any recommendation about what tools to use or not use. That's your personal pick. You should, at any rate, aggregate the logs, right? It does make sense to see, 20,000 log entries today. How many duplicates? Don't know. So that's why you need to aggregate, right? You want to see, hey, you have 15,000 instances of that. And if 15,000 instances of that it's a notice because I'm accessing a non-existing array key or something like that, it's really simple just to put a guard clause in front and say, let's do an is set, and if it's not set, then just do not try to access it. And it doesn't change the behavior, but the notice is gone. So that's an easy fix. And it's also a great sort of selling point for progress. Say, hey, we started off the whole migration thing. We had like 20,000 log entries a day. And that's a realistic number, by the way, unfortunately. And now we invested some time and we are down to, say, 5,000. I actually know of a company, they did a kind of bug hunt where they said, okay, we have 20,000 daily log messages, beer and pizza for everybody, like for a whole weekend. And they did a hackathon type of thing. And then they were down to a few hundred a day. And it was just a fun weekend, basically. So it's doable. And you should consider doing that. The ideal goal of having an application that does not output any warning message, whatever, is in practice, it's kind of hard to reach on legacy code. For new code, you should definitely plan and design that way. For legacy code, I'm fully aware that it's not really feasible. So in some way, you have to get rid of the noise. You can either do that by fixing stuff or by filtering, right? And then you have to make sure that you are able to find out what are the error messages that are new since we are running on PHP 7. Because essentially that's what you want to be able to do. Compare what errors, warnings, notices, and whatnot does my application produce on PHP 5 versus PHP 7. Of course, in an ideal world, where on PHP 5 the error log is clean, any new error has to be attributed to PHP 7, so that's easy. in reality world isn't that beautiful, so you will have to do some filtering, magic, whatever. Maybe you look at timestamps, whatever you come up with, you need to be able to see, okay, those are things that are just showing up on PHP 7, so we need to look into them. Because that's a warning then usually is a problem. And the nasty thing is that the problem doesn't necessarily show up where the warning shows up, but somewhere else. Spooky action at a distance, and you want to avoid that. Okay, third-party code. Actually, looking back at a few migration projects that we have supported, third-party code tends to be one of the bigger issues. And that is because at some point in time, somebody picked a library which was available at the time from wherever and basically dropped it in the code because a few years ago, before Composer, we kind of didn't have the clear structure of this is where third party goes. Maybe you have a lib directory, maybe not. Some teams have just inline third party code. So third party code and their own code is kind of mixed up in the SRC folder. And the problem with that is that most ancient third-party libraries are just not supported anymore. The more esoteric they become, they are not supported anymore today. So you will not be able to run them on PHP 7 because nobody has taken the effort to make them compatible with PHP 7. Now you have two choices. You can make them compatible to PHP 7. Now you have inherited code. It's now your code, you have to maintain it. Or you take a step back and say, okay, maybe we can replace that library. And maybe if you're lucky, there is a PHP 7 compliant or PHP 7 ready version of the library. So you really have to look into that. The first thing to do is create an inventory and find out what third-party code are we using. Nowadays, it tends to be simple. You just look at Composer.json and there it is. In code that dates back to before Composer times, we have, at least in part, there is dependencies that are not clearly made explicit somewhere. And there is also a license problem, potentially. I have seen people copying and pasting GPL code into their application, which technically or legally would make your application GPL due to infectious nature of GPL. So Stallman, hello, is going to hate me, but I think the GPL is less free than other licenses because it forces you to put your software under GPL license as well. And while that technically usually is just, nobody might care, from a legal perspective, it is important. And we have customers that have run audits and bring in external companies to kind of find unlicensed software. And that's also an issue that you have to keep in mind, which may also be a good selling point with regard to legal risks and issues. Especially pre-IPO companies are really keen on getting everything clean. And we have seen outrageous budgets being spent on, hey, we kind of want to get ready for an IPO. We are not telling you, but that's sort of the plan. And we really need to make sure that there are no legal risks because pre-IPO, if somebody sues us, that's a bad thing. So, of course, everybody waits maybe that happens more in the United States than it happens in Europe, but it's for some companies, it's an issue. Okay, so check for updated versions or consider replacements. And while you're at that, you should consider moving to Composer to make all those dependencies explicit. Because with the newer versions of those components, you want to be able to install them by Composer. There is really no point in trying to, I don't know. And I think it's PHP 5.3.2, that's the minimum requirement for Composer. So if you're before PHP 5.3, we're going to touch on that a little later. You have a bigger problem than others anyway. So maybe you need to get to a state where you can run Composer. But then on the other hand, I would assume that most of you are already running Composer anyway. So maybe that's less of an issue. Test automation, yes. Who has it? Yeah, somehow Sebastian has it, great. Of course, now this is the day where you realize, now I understand why we should have invested in test automation. Because then we could run our code on PHP 7 or run the tests, and if the tests fail, well, obviously there's a problem, and we don't have to find out in production or through a system test. But since you have not invested enough in test, or potentially not invested enough in test automation in the past, you have to pay now. Now, I'm not suggesting to say, well, just write unit tests for everything, because then you can refactor. That's not going to work. Usually, you cannot write unit tests for legacy code. That's kind of a black and white binary statement, so it's not 100% like that, but it's more like that than, oh, it's a breeze to write unit tests for legacy code. So let's just assume it's hard. You can't do that easily, so it's not an option. But you should look into characterization tests. And you can run them at different levels, use different technologies to run them. Essentially, what a characterization test is, you're running a test, and your code produces some output. Maybe an HTML page, maybe the result of a function, maybe an object, maybe a JSON document, whatever. And you capture that result. And then you run the test again on modified code, or in our case, on code running on PHP 7. And you capture the result. Now you compare the result with the original one. They should be the same. Well, there are cases where they aren't because of randomness, timestamps and stuff. I'm aware of that. That's a special case. But in general, you will be able to find places where the output needs to be the same. And if the output is not the same, there is a problem. We need to address that. So characterization tests do not tell you, yeah, everything is right and working. But they're just going to say, hey, the result is different. You might want to look into that. And it's up to you to decide whether that's a problem or it's okay. Maybe you'll just have to upgrade your expectation. Characterization tests don't really work well on the long run, because on the long run, your expectations always change. But on the short run, for the purposes of a migration, it's a great way of getting more security or less risk, or gain more confidence. That was what I'm trying to say. Because you kind of have proof that, well, this crucial piece of code behaves the same on PHP 7 than it used to do on PHP 5, maybe. So, where are you coming from when it comes to migrating? I'm kind of silently assuming that everybody is coming from PHP 5, and the question is, where are you going to? Well, I'm actually still seeing 32-bit systems or operating systems still running and being upgraded to 64-bit. In that direction, it's usually not a big problem, but there are some issues around that. If you're on a 32-bit operating systems, you have some other problems. Going the other way is kind of a really bad idea, which you probably don't want to do. We have some Windows versus Linux versus Mac issues, especially with capitalization. File system on Windows is not case sensitive. Linux is, so stuff that works on Linux might not work on Windows, so it's a really stupid idea to develop on Linux and deploy on Windows. The other way around is less of a problem, but you actually want to stay pretty consistent if you can. And I would like to raise the question whether upgrading to PHP 7 and changing the operating system should be done at the same time. Probably not. PHP 4 remnants. There is some things that were in PHP 4 that kind of still made it into PHP 5 code, and they were deprecated, but they still existed. And there is some nastinesses. We're going to go into some details. I'm not suggesting that you're still running PHP 4, even though I know that some companies are, but that's a whole different beast. So some of the nasty old stuff is register globals, which probably everybody has gotten rid of. Magic quotes is more of a problem. It was taken out in PHP 5, but in PHP 7, it actually got removed. So in PHP 5, the behavior was gone, but you could still have the calls, and now those calls don't work anymore in PHP 7. They are fatal errors. So you really have to, unfortunately, look into that again to make sure that whatever state is, if something does stuff with magic quotes, you want to make sure that on PHP 7 things work fine, because that's security relevant. If you ever find a PHP INI file with a Zent Engine 1 compatibility mode setting to true, change your job. Reassign this is something like a small weirdness that in PHP 5, I believe you could use this as a variable name, and in PHP 7 you can't. Those are kind of easy fixes, and just for the fun of it, in PHP 5, in some versions, you were able to define abstract private methods, which makes perfectly no sense, because abstract says, well, it has to be implemented in the base, in the subclass, and private says it's not visible in the subclass. So, yeah. And I'm not assuming that you have something like that in your code base. If you have, it's an easy fix. Yeah, just for the fun of that. So I think your goal is going to be to have the same PHP version from dev to production. And some people think, well, yes, that's what containers are for, right? Yeah, probably, maybe. So yes, if you feel like containers are going to help you, in some cases, it is a problem because like existing servers have an operating system where it's hard to get PHP 7 running, or the admins say, no, you can't install PHP 7 from that software source because we don't trust that source. So what you're going to do, you're going to do exactly that and lock it away in a container and deploy the container on live system, and you claim to have solved the problem, which I'm not sure you really have. So in some instances, containers can be useful, but please be aware that they come with an additional set of problems. So I would not automatically assume that you need any containerization to migrate to PHP 7. If you want to go into the container direction, you should try to make that a separate project. Containerize your application first and then make the migration a separate project. Otherwise, you're kind of mixing the risks. And honestly, I would prefer you guys to say to your boss, we screwed up the containerization project rather than we screwed up the migration project. So I want the risk on the other side. But that's just me. UTF-8. That's one of those nasty things nobody tends to think about. So if everything is UTF-8, we have absolutely no problem. In reality, it's not. And if you take your application out of an existing environment, chances are that some encoding stuff is going to be different, or maybe now it's all UTF-8 and in the past it was not. Be aware, there's a plethora of problems that you can run into, right? You need to set the encoding in the browser. What's the encoding the source code is in? What's the data I work with? What's the encoding of the database connection? So there is different spots where you can influence that. And first of all, it's a performance thing that suddenly you have to convert back and forth. And on the other hand, you can run into all those weird display problems. Japanese even have a term for that. It's called mojibake. I don't think I have the slide with the image. So when all the weird characters and yeah. So I have seen instances where that was absolutely not a problem. I have seen instances where it was a major problem because people had non-UTF-8 data in the database. And one of the worst things to do is having to guess encoding out of data, because you can just guess. The best thing you can do is basically look at something and say, oh, it has a byte sequence in it that doesn't exist in UTF-8, so that can't possibly be UTF-8. But that really doesn't help you in finding out what it is. There is libraries out there that do guessing, but they are more or less good depending on how big of a data set you have and how crappy your data is. So that's really a difficult issue. And it's in fact a data quality issue that technically has nothing to do with the PHP 7 migration, but usually turns up as part of the migration. So make sure that you are clean on that side. If you are not, you will have to invest pretty heavily on the business side in getting the content right. Because trying to use technology to fix broken content and broken encodings, I have never seen that work. It's just a pretty bad workaround that makes people very unhappy. So MySQL versus MySQLi. We are a little short on time, so I'm not going to go into details. MySQL is traditionally the way to speak to the database, and then MySQLi was a new way that came up. In fact, it was created because of GPL versus non-GPL code licensing issues. And MySQLi is a lot better. And MySQL has been deprecated for ages, but of course in legacy code nobody has touched that. So if that's a problem of yours, then I would suggest to use the shim that Davi Shafiq has created. Davi is an overall nice guy. He's British, bad luck, but I think he lives in the United States, so he's probably safe from Brexit. Davi is the guy who has created the original concept behind the FAR archives, so he's pretty well known in the PHP community, and I really like that piece of software. It's basically, you just drop it in, and then it internally maps your MySQL calls to MySQLi. Some people are going to tell you, well, it's just adding the I. That's not true, because MySQL, by default, if you didn't pass a database connection to a function, it would kind of magically get the database connection from global scope. And MySQLi doesn't do that anymore. So without explicitly passing a database connection, you're not going to have a lot of fun with MySQLi. And so now you have a dependency problem because you have to pass around that. And since legacy applications tend to be not that well versed for dependency injection, that can get pretty nasty, and that library solves that problem pretty nicely. Then people are going to say, well, we need prepared statements, or should we move to PDO? Just in briefness, no, you should not move to PDO. Please move to MySQLi. PDO is a very problematic extension that's not well maintained. And we have a shitload of licensing issues preventing us, or legal issues preventing us from getting a better PDO, because PDO, in fact, is a piece of code that contains code from Microsoft and Oracle and whatnot, and now guess they have lawyers, so forget about all that, right? That's essentially the problem with PDO. So I would strategically not try to use PDO, but rather use MySQL. And then prepared statements, again, that's nothing that's really part of the PHP 7 migration. So people are going to say, let's use prepared statements. Let's rewrite all the code. No, don't. Don't do it now. There is some, prepared statements do make some sense, but maybe not in the way you thought. And I've linked 2 blog posts by Ulf Wendel, who used to work for MySQL, now works for Oracle. And he's kind of responsible for a lot of that integration stuff, so he knows what he's talking about, and he basically explains what prepared statements really are and what they are not. And they are a little different in PHP than you may have thought. So, and here's my pro tip. When it comes to migrating to PHP 7, just make it work on PHP 7. In fact, one of the main jobs we have if we are coaching a team that does a migration is preventing the developers from changing everything. Because, that's ugly. We need to, make that more pretty, and that needs to be more up to date, and let's touch this and let's change that while we're at it. No. Because technically that's not related to your PHP 7 migration. It's going to make your project explode, more expensive and more risky. A PHP 7 migration is not there to make your code pretty. All the ugliness that may have been there before will still be in the code after that. You just have to fix the immediate problems. If you do that, and I know it's hard, but if you do that, your PHP 7 migration project will be a lot smaller than you have thought. I'm not saying that there's a lot of nifty things that you may run into or a lot of problems that you may or may not have, but if you really stick to, let's just do what it takes to get it run on PHP 7 now, and we can have, we can create a refactoring ticket for later. It's never going to get prioritized, but we can create a ticket. Okay? You cannot make everything work at the same time. Please keep that in mind. And then, if you run on PHP 7, there's going to be a lot of deprecation warnings, which you will see, because now you have error reporting set to -1, and you're actually looking at the aggregated logs. And it's going to say, everything is deprecated. Yeah, that's bad. But that just means that it is not going to work on PHP 8 anymore. And that tells you you should address this. You should address this now, and not when you actually want to roll out PHP 8, because it just tells you, well, you did it that way, and PHP 8 is not going to support that way. Be welcome to do it a different way, and it's going to work on PHP 7, so it's not going to be a migration issue, which ultimately leads us to reach the goal that I would like to reach, for everybody to reach. That's what I call agile migration. I don't want migration to be a big project. I want migration to happen a little every year or maybe every month. So why not migrate in smaller incremental steps? There is a certain date, maybe every quarter, where you update all your dependencies, right? You shouldn't like magically do that and then complain that something broke, but maybe you want to keep them as they are, so you have a stable set of software, and then at a given point in time, you'll take a few days, upgrade all the dependencies, do some testing, hopefully not manually, and see whether things work out or where it breaks. And that's a little migration that you've done. It's off the list for the big migration to the next major version of PHP. I would suggest to upgrade PHP in a yearly cycle. PHP does have a stable release cycle these days. We get a new minor version every year, usually November, December. And I would suggest to kind of wait a little until the first 2 or 3 patch releases. So around summer, it should be pretty safe to upgrade to the PHP version that got released the previous year, right? And when you do that, then you have smaller incremental steps. Sounds just like Agile, right? And it's going to be less of a project, but more of a process. Thanks.